have a role to play, and I find it notable that he has said the Democratic memo should be released, and he's not the only one of Republicans. I want to point out when reporters and Republicans were at the retreat this past week, Senator John Thune, the third-ranking Senate Republican, said not only should the Democratic memo release, the Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Richard Burr should have probably had a chance to look at the memo, which he did not. So I think that how the Speaker navigates this in the coming week, particularly with the increased pressure coming from Democrats on the president to get this other memo released. We saw a letter from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer this morning stressing that point. The Speaker is going to have a critical role to play here.
Let's bring in Democratic Congressman Heck of Washington. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman Heck, thank you very much for your time tonight. I really appreciate you being here. Can you walk us through what you anticipate are going to be the next steps for the House Intelligence Committee around the memo that the Democrats have written?
I'm fully expecting, Kasie, that we will take it up at our business meeting tomorrow, Monday afternoon, when the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence convenes. We have already been in the process of subjecting the Democratic memo to a review by the Department of Justice and FBI because we think that's the correct thing to do. Then we will take a vote on it, whether it is redacted by suggestions from DOJ or not. And I'm hopeful, I'm cautiously optimistic that the majority party will join us in voting to declassify this material.
How do you view how the Republicans handled releasing their memo? I mean, do you still feel as though they should have waited until yours could go through the process? I mean, they, in some ways, do have a point that you didn't pull this together until much farther down the line. The Republican memo had already been pretty much finished.
Right, because we didn't have much notice, Kasie. Let's be very clear about this. So I think the Republican memo has been revealed broadly and deeply for exactly what it is, which is as a political document whose sole purpose, frankly, is to frame the FBI for doing their job. Now, we know that that Republican memo is politically motivated in every regard. And we know this because, for example, when we asked Chairman Nunes whether he or any of his staff members had coordinated with any parties at the White House to develop and write the memo, he refused to answer. And we know it's politically motivated because when we brought forth our Democratic memo and asked them to just wait for the release of their memo until ours could also be released, they said no, without being able to answer the question, what harm would be done by waiting a few more days? They had no answer to that either, Kasie.
Congressman, what can you tell us about the content of the Democratic memo? I get the sense that the focus here is likely to be on this question of whether or not the FISA court had additional information besides the Steele dossier in its decision-making process.
It's a point-by-point refutation of the basically propaganda talking points in the Republican memo. But the truth of the matter is the Republican memo argues with itself as well because their basic assertion about whether or not the so-called dossier was the basis for the FISA application is disproved in their own information, and we take that a step farther. Look, Kasie, there were a lot of questions raised about the whole Russian investigation this week, none of which we're talking about right here and now and should, namely, why did the president let Monday go by without implementing the sanctions on Russia that passed the Congress by an aggregated vote of 517 to 5? Those sanctions should be implemented. Why won't the president sit down with Director Mueller and answer his questions as he once promised to do? Why isn't the president decrying the fact that Russia is, as we sit and speak here now, interfering in the Mexican national election coming up in May, according to his own national security advisor? So there were a lot of questions raised this week about Russian interference, none of which have anything to do with the Republican memo, which again seeks to deceive and deflect and distract people from the central issues.
What do you say to the House Speaker Paul Ryan, who has urged his conference not to make any connections here between this memo and the Mueller investigation? Do you have any concerns about abuse of FISA power?
I have considerable concerns about abuse of power by the White House, who has sought to politicize both our national law enforcement agency and the politicization of classified material. That's where I think the abuse of power has come into play of late.
Congressman Heck, thank you very much for your time, and I'm sure I will be seeing you up on Capitol Hill this week. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kasie.
I want to circle back.